talks about supporting industries. And one of the things, in addition to trading literally in the people themselves, of course, all of what goes on around that. And so in addition to the auctioneers and commission merchants, who were usually involved in commodities of all kinds, many of the brokers included people who had their offices along East Carey Street, from west of 15th to about 19th Street. And then there were the many businesses that serviced the trade, so law firms, insurance companies, blacksmith shops, and dry goods stores, and including the original Thalheimer's one-room business that was actually on this block. And they started a little further down. Their next store, the one that this one particularly refers to, was I think in the middle of this block. And I believe when I looked on the website, the Thalheimer's company, real estate company, is still involved in real estate in this area and with this block. I think something recently sold from this block through the Thalheimer organization. So people are still around. We're not just talking about the past. We're actually living continuous lives, connected. We're not, it goes on. So this is again why we raise these things up. That store was founded in 1842, and then there were clothing houses that made sure that those who were waiting to be sold, as the painting is titled, were dressed for sale. One of the things that always sort of strikes me about the idea of the blacksmith shops in particular, was thinking about things again that are the most mundane, the things that you every day you're going to deal with. You're going to go to the store, you're going to get, but the blacksmiths made everything. They made your cooking pots, they made the nails, and everything was made. You didn't just go and order things. You went and you bought them, or you had them made directly by the person who was going to make them, or the company that made them. So a blacksmith, they probably had blacksmiths, every 3 or 4 blocks, if not several on a block. And it was that important to daily life. So, all right, the next one, we're going to walk down this lovely line of trees. Yes, I'm sorry. And enslaved workers. And of course, it's important to understand that even in a slave society, there are going to be African people who are not enslaved, and that can be for many reasons. In the earliest years, it could be that they were brought over, in the very earliest years, as indentured servants, and they may have, served the time of their servitude, and then, one of the policies was to give people a mule or an oxen and a little bit of land and a tiny bit of seed money, and let them start their lives. But that was pretty much in the early 1600s. It didn't go on much beyond that. Fairly quickly, there were laws that were put into place to make servitude permanent for Africans, and if a white worker either committed a crime or tried to break out of their agreement, they might get an extended period of indentured servitude, but they would not be held in permanent unless they happened to pass away while they were in servitude. But it's a beginning of a period that really starts to create the rifts between what I like to describe as the working people, farmers and workers and laborers. Shared much more in common before they began to be taught that their race made them distinct from each other and therefore subject to different treatment. And that's an indoctrination that we are still living with, and that's one of the real shames, and it's one of the reasons why it's so important to uncover all of this and the way that it came about. So this particular marker, again, I'm just going to read it because otherwise I could stop waxing. The story of labor enslaved and free is critical to the story of Shockoe Bottom. Industrial employers such as the Tredegar Iron Works, Virginia Central Railroad, and the Halifax Flour Mill preferred to contract for enslaved laborers, which helped keep wages for free workers as low as possible, while increasing racial resentments and thus their control over the workforce. Free and enslaved blacks worked in the tobacco factories and flour mills, on the docks, on the canal, first as laborers and then as boatmen. They were very much involved in the building of the canal. in shipyards and in warehouses. Enslaved and immigrant women worked as domestics. Washing clothes was one of the largest and most poorly paid independent fields of work for free black and white women. Mary Bowser was a black woman born into slavery but later freed and educated by her former owner, Richmonder Elizabeth Van Lew. During the Civil War, Van Lew organized a Union spy operation and arranged for Bowser to be hired as a domestic in the White House of the Confederacy, from which Bowser regularly supplied information to the Union troops. The two were never caught. But to speak to the story of Mary Bowser, the fact that she could be hired as a domestic into the White House of the Confederacy and have her presence there be considered so, again, so mundane, and then to have such low expectations of her intellectual capacity that they couldn't imagine that she would actually be a spy, much less an effective spy, and she was in that house for 4 years. So it's quite a story of both domestic servitude and resistance. So.
Mary Elizabeth Bowser was finally given recognition by being inducted into the U.S. Military Intelligence Hall of Fame.
Thank you. Shockoe is called jails and auction houses, but it actually goes into a little bit more than that. And again, it's nice to be able to work in these stories of fight back, right? About a half a dozen jails were scattered around the district. The most notorious was Lumpkin's Jail, a complex known as the Devil's Half Acre that included a small hotel and a restaurant. Smaller jails, some of them just penned areas, were often attached to traders' offices. Shockoe Bottom held some 40 to 50 auction sites, most of them along 15th Street, known at the time as Wall Street, but other auction houses were held in places like the Exchange, St. Charles and City Hotels, the Metropolitan and Oddfellows Halls, and Bell's Tavern, located a block or so west of 15th. And actually there's a marker for Bell's Tavern right at the corner of 15th and Main. By this time, the export of enslaved Africans was Virginia's largest commercial enterprise. This area here where the 17th Street Farmers Market is, and possibly close to where we're standing now, there was a thing called the Cage. The Cage was a jail for men of both races who misbehaved. Probably public drunkenness, public fighting, things like that. But it was one location here where the men of both races were held in the same, could be held in the same place. But also what was near here was the town whipping post and a dunking pool. So methods of punishment have shifted a little bit from now to then, but just understand too that there was this idea that punishment was public humiliation, public displays in order to presumably give the example that you would not want to follow. But that would have been right about in this area here. The story of resistance, of course, talks about the 1841 group of enslaved Africans that were held at Lumpkin's Jail before being shipped on board the Creole. The Creole was a brig. It was owned by a pair of Richmond traders named Johnson and Epperson, and it was headed to the slave market of New Orleans, which was the only one at that time that was larger than Richmond's. While off the coast of British-controlled Nassau, the enslaved women and men, a number of them, not all of them, led by a man named Madison Washington, who had previously escaped from slavery in Richmond, only to be recaptured when he returned to try and free his wife. They docked in Nassau, and the self-emancipated blacks found their freedom. Because it was a British territory and slavery was already outlawed there, they were declared to be free. One of the issues that came up in that case was the fact that the owners, the investors here, wanted compensation if Britain was going to let them go. But they actually claimed that they hadn't been sold yet, and so they were not actually enslaved or the property of anyone, and so they did not pay them compensation, at least not right away. I believe later they did. Were you going to? Bottom talks about basically what a working day could be like. So from sunup to sundown, Shockoe Bottom was alive with the activities of men, women, and children. black, white, and immigrant. There was a Jewish community down here as well. The enslaved workers often lived independently in boarding houses. Some enslaved men married to or in relationships with enslaved domestic workers would live with them in their owners' homes. Slaves and free black dwellings have also been identified on 18th and 19th Streets, as well as in the center of the block between Franklin and Main, 19th and 20th. Tenement quarters, while crowded and unhealthy, did provide other small enterprises owned by free blacks a place to do business, and provided the basis for the emergence of a black business class, which supported institutions such as the First African Baptist Church at College and East Broad Streets. Again, it's just a reinforcement of the idea that we want to be able to think about the fact that people were living daily lives. You get up in the morning, you have your first meal of the day, you go to your job, if you have a job, and and all of the people that you encounter in the course of your day in the 1830s, in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, just the way we do now. People have those individualized relationships as well as the relationships to the larger groups. So it always makes things more complicated. It's the reason why Silas Omohundro and Robert Lumpkin both took black wives. They could, first of all. And second of all, close quarters breeds relationships. And we lived much, in a way, we probably lived more integrated lives at that time. There was a researcher with the Museum of the Confederacy who did a survey of people in the directory, and essentially because of the working relationships of people, they lived in a much more integrated situations than we have done since the end of the Civil War and since Jim Crow and segregation became a formalized way of living. So it's important to understand those dynamics so that we don't act surprised at things that come up that are pretty normal. But it also helps make sure that we are looking at as truthful a dynamic around any given situation as we can. None of that, and I hope that no one would assume that I am trying to bridge some kind of gap between saying that, the idea that some people will say there were kind people who owned slaves and things like that. There's some things that it doesn't matter whether you were kind or not. It doesn't matter in a way whether you got along or not. We are in a time where we have to face the fact that slavery was an unconscionable institution, and there were people who knew that then as well as now, and people who fought together, and black and white and immigrant and Jewish people fought together against slavery and injustices in society just as often as they fought each other to preserve the status quo. So that makes for, as usual, a very complicated existence. And so we are still struggling with those dynamics now in the decisions that we face around how we build our cities. So the next marker we're going to go to is going to take a slightly different tack. So join me.